So this lecture and discussion time is it's basically the 11th unit of the class, and it's for the Tuesday, Thursday classes, class number 13, and we're starting Luke. So we've done a good job, I feel like, looking at some of the characteristic points of Matthew and Mark. And so we go to the third gospel, Luke, and like I say, I'm going to break this lecture up into two parts that are about half an hour each. And so the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible pages are 595 to 606. And again, looking at Luke, so if you have your Bibles with you, you can turn to Luke. We'll be reading out of Luke some, and certainly having the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible open sometimes is helpful to help me find page numbers if I have something wrong in my notes. Well, who is the intended audience for the Gospel of Luke? That's the first question that I want you to get a handle on. Who is the intended audience for the Gospel of Luke? Well, let's review just a little bit. Who was the intended audience for Matthew? Matthew and Luke are the two Gospels that we kind of focus a little bit of attention on that. And we want to keep in mind, these are not real hard and fast rules, but they're generalities that help us to understand some of the things within these Gospels. So, anyone remember, what did we say for Matthew? Who was the apparent intended audience?
The Jew.
Primarily a Jewish audience. Now, not exclusively. Matthew has some Gentile heroes. Now, Mark, we didn't focus a lot of attention on that. We looked at some of the other characteristics of individuality or uniqueness in terms of Mark. But with Luke, it is significant for us to take a look at that, the intended audience. And the first thing that we would need to say concerning the intended audience for the Gospel of Luke is that it's an individual named Theophilus. Theopi, there's a P-I for the F sound. Philus, Theophilus. Yes, and you'll see it there. We're going to read it in the first couple verses, but it's Theo, Theo, and then Philus. I don't know if you've studied Latin any. Some of you perhaps have. Eastern has offered Latin classes before. But Theo, what is Theo? What's the root Theo mean? God. Okay, that's why theology is the study about God, and some people, look at that. And then how about Philus or philo? Love. Good. Like Philadelphia is based on Greek and Latin roots. I think perhaps it's just all Greek. I mean, I know no Latin whatsoever, but I know that these are also related to Greek. So maybe that's what I should be saying, because I can document that, and I don't know much about Latin or how to document roots from there, but without doing a lot of work. Philadelphia, Adelphos is the word for brother, and so Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, is something we're familiar with a little bit in our history because of our cities by that name. So Theophilus is literally lover of God. But it certainly has been suggested a time or two in history that Luke wrote this, and he kind of gave that a code name of a person who maybe doesn't exist, but he's just writing to all people who are lovers of God. But the majority of scholars that I have read feel like the way that he words Luke, and there's another book in the Bible that we feel like Luke also wrote, and we'll get to that later. It's because it's not Matthew or Mark, and so we'll get to all the rest later, of course, as we're doing them in canonical order. So, but most scholars feel like it's a particular individual, it's a real individual, and that was his name. And so, I'd like to read just the first 4 verses of Luke at this point, and of course we'll read more a little bit later, but it helps us to see how Luke begins. It's a little bit different from how Matthew and Mark begin, and we're introduced to this individual named Theophilus. Chapter 1, verse 1 of Luke says, Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have the certainty concerning the things you have been taught. And so you see, it sounds like an official title. He calls him the most excellent Theophilus. Some have suggested perhaps that Theophilus might have financially supported the work and maybe commissioned the work, and so that's a possibility. That would make sense with some of the language that's used, but not an absolute requirement. And so specifically we would say the intended audience is Theophilus. That's kind of the obvious answer based on the first 4 verses, but there's another way that I need you to know how to answer that question. Who is in the intended audience for the Gospel of Luke? In addition to having the individual, the name Theophilus, the proper noun, the personal name, you also should say in general that it was, we think that Luke was probably had in mind a non-Jewish readers, for reasons that we'll continue to discuss as we progress through the material. We feel that the intended audience for Luke was non-Jewish readers. So that gives us a contrast between Matthew and Luke right away, and helps us to understand some of the differences in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. So the next question is this: what is the relationship between Luke and the Gospel of Luke? And what do we know about Luke, about him? What is the relationship between Luke and the Gospel of Luke? And what do we know about him? What is the relationship between Luke and the Gospel of Luke, and what do we know about him? Well, like Matthew and Mark, Luke does not begin his gospel. We're getting used to this genre, this literary style of gospel, of kind of the first century biography. It's a little bit different from the way biographies have been written at other time periods. And if you've read a lot of biographies, you'll notice that these do not follow the pattern, perhaps, of modern day biography. But we're getting used to the genre, and Luke does not just come right out and say from the beginning, hey everybody, this is Luke, and I've got some things I want to share with you, almost the way Paul begins the letters. And so the Gospel of Luke, not only does he not identify himself at the beginning, his name is not in the book at all. The Gospel of Luke does not mention the individual Luke, but all evidence points to the author being Luke the doctor, Paul's friend and companion on his missionary journey. So let me ask you to get that in your notes. That's pretty significant, and we're going to read just one verse from Colossians that help us to identify Luke a little bit. The Gospel of Luke doesn't mention the author's name, but all evidence points to the author being Luke, who was a doctor. We'll read the verse that identifies him as a doctor. One of Paul's friends, that's very significant. And he was a companion with Paul on his missionary journey. So the book of the Bible, we haven't covered it yet, the book of the Bible that helps us to know about Paul's missionary journeys is the book of Acts. And so that's the book that we're going to see Luke's name quite frequently. And when we get to the book of Acts, we'll see Luke's name in those accounts, but we do not see it. Now, let's review a little bit. I'm going to, with Matthew, was Matthew one of the 12 disciples, also called apostles? Matthew was. Okay, good. Someone else. Was Mark one of the 12 disciples, also called apostles? No. Matt's shaking his head no, it's correct. Now Luke we haven't talked about, but we have talked about the 12 disciples on several occasions. Do you remember one named Luke? And it's confusing, I know, because sometimes you they have different names. Like Matthew is called Levi in one gospel, or sometimes it's explained Matthew, who was also called Levi, or something like that. But there's not one named Luke. So when you have a gospel writer written by someone who's not a disciple or apostle, it's important to know maybe where did he get his information from? Who did he communicate with? How did he get this information? Mark, this is a review once again, we feel like Mark almost certainly got his information from, anybody? Peter, good. And so Matthew, of course, was one of the disciples. Now Luke, his association with Paul is very significant. Was Paul one of the 12 disciples? No, he was not either. Excellent. But Paul was considered one of the apostles. He calls himself an apostle, even though he wasn't one of the 12. Remember, the word apostle literally means missionary, and Paul certainly fits the bill. We'll see that in Acts, that he was, one that was used as a missionary for the Christian church quite clearly, and probably. I mean, if you had to choose one person, after we finish looking at the book of Acts or the New Testament in general, we say, who was the primary missionary, we'll probably say Paul. And so, certainly calling him an apostle kind of makes sense. But, he got his information from his associations with some of the early apostles, but also he makes a case that, God revealed himself to Paul in different ways, and we'll see that in the book of Acts that, he kind of had a blinding vision, and in fact he literally could not see for several days, and then and God, communicated to him that I want you to be the one that's going to share the good news of my son with the Gentiles. So we'll talk about that. So the question was, again, to bring back to the notes and to get all the information that you want to have for this section. What is the relationship between Luke and the Gospel of Luke, and what do we know about him? So the relationship is that his name is not really mentioned, but it's just the evidence. And again, this is there's a strong consensus on this evidence. This is not one of the books that's authorship has been very debated and historically by those that have studied the New Testament and the dating of the Gospels and the authorship and so forth. So the evidence points to the author being Luke, the doctor, Paul's friend and companion on his missionary journeys. And some of the evidence for that we'll see as we continue to move through, and especially when we look at that other book that Luke wrote. We feel. So I told you I was going to read Colossians, and that's Colossians 4:14. The reason why old people like these iPads is because the font is big. That helps us. You guys like them because you know how to do more things with them, but I don't know how to do much, but I sure like the big font. Okay, Colossians 4:14. Let me read. Let me back up a little bit. So Colossians is a letter we will talk later on that is written from Paul to the Christians in Colossae or Colossae. Again, we're going from one language to another, and it's pronounced different ways. But oftentimes Paul will give greetings in his letters, and this is just a little 4-chapter letter. And so in this 4th chapter, fairly close to the end, there's only 18 verses in this chapter, and we're looking at verse 13 and or 14. He says, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. And I mean, that's it. That's all we get. But anyway, that's where we see that he's a physician. That's one of the references. It's perhaps the only one that refers to him as a beloved physician. And of course, the word beloved just tells us that Paul had a favorable opinion of Luke, and that, and again, we kind of see that in the book of Acts. And near the end, the last verse, let me just jump to verse 18. Paul says, I, Paul, read this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. This is one of what we'll call the prison epistles later on when we talk about the epistles, because he wrote it from prison. And so Paul had some friends who would help him and maybe provide for his needs when he was in prison at times. And so, But that's all kind of foreshadowing what we'll look at in the book of Acts. Okay, the third question for today, in terms of this first half lecture, which is going to be kind of obvious at this point, but again, some of these questions will be jumbled all together with other questions on future quizzes and exams. So make sure to get this information down. Which gospel writer almost certainly was not a Jew? Which gospel writer was almost certainly not a Jew? Well, I've said many times all the first disciples were Jewish people, so it's not Matthew, right? We know Matthew and we know John. He was one of the 12 disciples. So these were people that were from within the Jewish nation, descendants, literal descendants of Israel or Jacob. And so it's got to be either Mark or Luke. And of course, we're covering Luke right now, so that's where you'd probably guess, and you'd be right. Luke is almost certainly not a Jew. Now, we can't say that absolutely positively as in terms of some of the things that the New Testament states, but we do feel like there's good evidence that Luke himself was not a Jew. And so not only is Luke not a disciple, but he is quite possibly a Gentile. You'll see that in the textbook on page 595, I think, is where that's listed, and in a few other sources I've seen that as well. So again, we can't say it with absolute certainty in terms of the text doesn't specifically say that, as it does for some people, and yet that is the general awareness that among the answer to that question would almost certainly be Luke would be our best answer for that. Like I say, when I give you a quiz or an exam, choose the best answer according to our textbook and according to the New Testament itself. So, which gospel writer almost certainly is not a Jew? That would be Luke. Number 4, true or false? All 4 Gospels mention the virgin birth of Jesus. All 4 Gospels mention the virgin birth of Jesus. In Matthew, we talked about that a little bit, I believe. We certainly could have, because Matthew talks about that. And one of the extraordinary events in the life of Christ is that Mary was visited by an angel, and she said, we're going to read this a little bit later, not with this particular note, but a little bit later we're going to read this in connection with another question. But an angel appeared to Mary and said that she was blessed, and that she would be with child and give birth to a son, and she was to give him the name Jesus, and he would save his people from their sins. And that is what the New Testament teaches, and what Christians have believed for centuries, is that she became pregnant through a miracle in which, having never known a man, sometimes the biblical language uses the word know to reference as know intimately, as in having sexual intercourse. And so without having ever known a man, she became pregnant miraculously, and that's called the virgin birth. And that is referred to in Matthew. And I'll tell you that we're going to read later that it's referred to in Luke. So true or false? All 4 Gospels mention the virgin birth of Jesus. Did anyone want to venture a guess there, or remember from their reading? It is false. It turns out that Matthew and Luke only that's half the Gospel writers, but Matthew and Luke describe the virgin birth of Jesus. Mark and John do not. And seldom is it mentioned in the rest of the New Testament. Now, it's obviously significant, right? Because that's quite an extraordinary miracle. However, it's not as significant as, let's say, remember we talked about, according to Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, the climax of Mark was, and indeed it said the whole New Testament was the death of Christ. All 4 Gospels refer to the death of Christ. And I said to you that, of course, the death and resurrection are usually kind of seen together. And so certainly the death and the resurrection of Christ are alluded to in all 4 Gospels, and they are referred to numerous times throughout the rest of the New Testament. So they're extraordinarily important. However, in Luke, we do have a reference to the virgin birth of Christ, which we will look at a little bit later. Okay, now, just something that the textbook brings attention to, which may be of interest to us here in our area of the world, is this kind of a geographical question, or topological perhaps. Where were both John the Baptist and Jesus honed for ministry? Honed, I think the textbook puts that in quotation marks, or maybe I put it in quotation marks because that's the word the textbook used. H-O-N-E-D, or meaning prepared. Where were both John the Baptist and Jesus honed for ministry, a place that had long been associated with prophetic inspiration? That's all, the whole thing is the question. Where were both John the Baptist and Jesus honed for ministry, prepared for ministry by God Himself, according to the New Testament? And this is a place that had long been associated with prophetic inspiration. Anybody remember? Well,
Their home?
Well, in general, it's kind of like a region or a type of place, but the way the book describes it is the desert. The desert. And, we think of preparation for something significant, like people go to school. You're all at a stage in your life where you're investing a lot of time and money and energy in preparing for something. You're allowing E&MU, in a sense, to hone you for some occupation or some opportunities. And so we associate sometimes preparation for significant events with, not deserts so much as maybe cities where there's a bringing together of resources, like in your case professors and a lot of computers and a lot of it takes a lot of resources to run the university. At this point, at this season of the year, our president, Dr. Steve Gamble, spends a lot of his time in Santa Fe to help E&MU to get all the resources that are available to us. And that's really significant in higher education, that pooling of resources to help us to be able to remodel the buildings when they get old, and to have a lot of technology and scholarship aid and things like that. So that's a huge portion of his job as president of the university, and so he's done well in that, but it's not easy. But that's what we think about resources, having resources. So someone think, if you want to be a model, or I know people that are architects and they spend time in New York and things like that, because that's where they feel are the greatest opportunities to be prepared and so forth. And so a lot of people would have think Jerusalem, where all these great teachers are, and we've talked about Paul a little bit in the book of Acts. We'll see that Paul was brought up by a very well-known Jewish teacher named Gamaliel, if I remember right his name. And so he was born in one place, but he got sent to another place to grow up so that he could be prepared for life as a Jewish adult. And he was a Pharisee, that group that we've talked about as being the religious purists. But not John the Baptist and not Jesus. They were home for ministry in the desert, a place where they were away from all resources, away from the luxuries and the benefits of living, where there's plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of people to help you whenever you need help, and so it's a little bit different in terms of how we see it. And within the Old Testament, there's somewhat of a tradition of prophets being set apart from the luxuries and the primary resources that were brought together in city areas, and so you get this tradition of the prophetic tradition being associated also with the desert, and so we'll see some examples of that. In fact, I don't have the reference down, but I don't remember reading too much of that in Matthew. Let's see. See, in Luke chapter 3, we read that in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee. This was a different Herod than the one that we read at the beginning of the Matthew, because at this point this is chapter 3, so this is not around the birth of Christ. This is much later. You'll see in just a moment. So this other Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee and his brother Philip, tetrarch of region. These are both sons of that other Herod that we read about in early Matthew. Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. This is, notice, not John the son of Zebedee, John the son of Zechariah. This is the John that came to be known as John the Baptist. And he went into the region around the Jordan. At the end of verse 3 it said, the word came to John the son of Zechariah in the wilderness. And that is the word that is sometimes translated desert. And he went into all the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And that is why he is known as John the Baptist. He came a little bit before the time of Christ, and his ministry was emphasizing repentance and baptism, turning away from evil and wickedness and sin, and being baptized as an expression of your desire to, a person's desire to indeed repent and turn toward God instead of turning away from Him. All right. Let's see. Let's do one more question, and then we'll pause for that little break in between the two parts of the lectures. What do we know of Jesus' boyhood? What do we know of Jesus' boyhood? Well, not very much. We know just basically one story in Luke chapter 2, verse 41 that we'll read about, and the answer to the question, you can summarize it any way you like, but the way I have it is, Jesus staying behind when his parents left Jerusalem after the Passover when he was 12. That's basically all we know of Jesus' boyhood. Now, not, his infancy and his young adult, or, his ministry as an adult. We know more information about, especially his ministry. We know a little bit about his infancy and childhood. But boyhood, very little. Basically there's an event where Jesus stays behind when his parents left Jerusalem after the Passover when he was 12. So at 12 years old, his parents go to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when they get ready to go home, they're traveling in a group, and they think that he's with some, their relatives or friends or something. And after some number of, miles, they realize our 12-year-old boy is not anywhere to be found. They go back to Jerusalem. They leave the caravan and go back. And so we're going to read about that in Luke chapter 2, verse 41. Luke chapter 2, verse 41. Now, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, as many Jewish families did, regardless of where they lived. If they were even pretty far away from Jerusalem, every year, many Jewish people would go to Jerusalem. Many Jewish people would go to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover, that fantastically significant event for Jewish people, where they were celebrating how God delivered the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt back in the time of Moses and in the Old Testament, as described in the book of Exodus, because God, brought them out. He helped them to leave or to exit from Egypt by his, miraculous plagues. He punished the Egyptians and because of their sins and their worship of false gods, with a series of plagues, and eventually ended up opening the Red Sea so that the Israelites could go through and delivering them from the Egyptians. So the Passover is all part of that event. The last plague was the death angel that would kill the firstborn child of any household. And the Jewish people put the blood of a Passover lamb on the door frame, and that way the angel of death would know to pass over that house. So they have the Feast of the Passover. It's probably the most significant event in terms of Jewish tradition in remembering that God is a great deliverer and delivered his people, the Israelites. Verse 42, and when Jesus, was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. As a parent of 4, I can tell you this is every parent's nightmare, to feel like someone might have kidnapped your child, and so the reaction that we're going to see from Mary and Joseph, are completely understandable. And yet this happens from time to time that people, lose track of one of their kids. And especially when you're in a caravan and it's customary for the kids to be, sometimes with with their uncle or cousin or whatever. So when they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. Verse 46, after 3 days they found him in the temple. Remember, there was lots of synagogues, but there was just one temple. It was a central meeting place. It was significant. And so after 3 days they found him at 12 years old in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Now, you're going to see as we keep reading that Jesus, it wasn't just like a whole bunch of 12-year-olds that were all doing this. That Jesus had there was kind of like a crowd that had gathered around Jesus, and he was doing 2 things. It said listening to them and asking them questions. But evidently, the questions that he was asking revealed an extraordinary amount of wisdom. And yet, it's kind of interesting that we picture Jesus as being a teacher and always telling people things and instructing. But of course, that was when he was older. At this point, we see him listening. And in fact, that's the things that Luke notes, is that he was listening and asking questions. Now, of course, asking questions was how the rabbis taught. That was one of their techniques, is asking a lot of questions. So, nonetheless, that's what it says, is that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So, it was give and take. He was also answering questions perhaps that they were asking. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." As we would all certainly understand. And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" So Jesus here has an understanding. We don't, people will debate about when did Jesus, realize. I'm sure that, Mary would have explained to him as a child some of the events surrounding the visit of the angel and the miraculous conception and his birth and the shepherds who came, and then later on the wise men came and all that. That this would have been perhaps part of things that he would have heard a lot about. And yet certainly here at 12 he says, being in the temple, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept when it was when at different times in history and so forth, that was seen as the place of God's presence. And he says, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Well, that's all we know of Jesus' boyhood. Not very much. There are some other stories that circulate in other writings, not that are not found in the New Testament. So, but our topic for the semester is the New Testament and what it contains, and so that's what we'll look at. So that's the answer to the question: what do we know of Jesus' boyhood? All right, we're going to pause for a moment and we'll pick up with the lecture in a moment.